Hello, my name is James Bundy, and I am the Director of Operations for Freedom Declared Foundation. I am delighted to be joined today by Derek McAuley for our latest interview about the state of freedom of religion or belief within the United Kingdom. Derek is chair of the British chapter of the International Association for Religious Freedom, which was the first international interfaith body and takes a particular interest in safeguarding minority perspectives within larger faith groups. He is a former chief officer of the General Assembly of Unitarian and Free Christian Churches. He previously served as a trustee of the Interfaith Network of the UK and holds several other charity trusteeships. Thank you for joining us today, Derek.
Thank you, James. Looking forward to our discussion.
So am I. The first question to begin is, how do you define freedom of religion or belief?
Yeah, it's an interesting question coming from the IARF background. We look and specify it's not just about freedom of religion, it's freedom in religion. So it is about promoting a form of religious life, but recognizing clearly that freedom of conscience is a key element of that. And therefore, we're not simply pursuing a human rights approach. We look at the whole interfaith dimension, promoting understanding, promoting cooperation, looking at tolerance in culture, tolerance within religion, maintaining links between individuals and organizations, really striving for international understanding, within the frame of freedom of religion.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the one thing that I picked up on there was the interfaith approach rather than the human rights approach. Because often when we talk about freedom of religion or belief, we talk about Article 18 of the UN Human Rights and Article 9 of the European Convention. How does your definition of freedom of religion or belief align with Article 18?
Yeah, clearly the Universal Declaration is a key document, and there are a host of NGOs working in the field of religious freedom, and some reference Article 18 explicitly. So the whole idea of the inherent dignity and equal worth of every individual is clearly fundamental. IARF predates the Universal Declaration. We were formed in 1900, very much out of the liberal Protestant tradition, Unitarian tradition, but also embracing liberal religious perspectives within Judaism, increasingly within Islam, and within Hinduism. And then in more recent years, we've become a much more broader interfaith in terms of our background with Sikh members, Japanese Shinto religion, Japanese lay Buddhist, huge organization in Japan. So as we've become more interfaith in our membership, clearly that influences how we approach religious freedom, because religious freedom is not just, well, let's change the law and everybody will be free. Clearly, the whole idea of society and societal attitudes are as important as the law, and most of the global surveys, the global analysis clearly point to, well, what is the law in the particular country? So in the UK, we can point to the Human Rights Act. It reflects the European Convention and all of our legal obligations. But the important thing, well, what are societal attitudes that underpin the law? Sometimes the law is ahead of societal attitudes. Sometimes the law is behind in particular countries. So that's why I think that interfaith element is important, because genuine, close interfaith relationships will underpin freedom of religion within the law.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned the difference between the legal freedom of religion or belief and societal, because that has come up already in quite a few interviews that we've done. And other people who we've interviewed have suggested that whilst the UK has freedom of religion or belief within the law, we don't necessarily have it fully implemented in society. What is your take on that opinion?
That's interesting, because the United Kingdom is one of the few nations in the world, for example, that has an established religious, in our case, a church. In England, not in Wales, not in Northern Ireland. We have a national church in Scotland. We have bishops of the Church of England sitting in one of our houses of parliament, which is unusual, to say the least. It is said that Iran is the only other nation in the world where religious leaders sit in a political decision-making body as of right. So I think there are issues around aspects of how the institutions of the United Kingdom work, which is actually the opposite, in fact, the opposite of what you've said. I find the contrast with the United States quite interesting, where they have in the law, the state cannot endow any religion in their constitution. So there's a very explicit division between church and state, but yet societal attitudes regarding freedom of religion, it would have been very, very restrictive, and in fact getting worse with increased polarization in the United States in recent years with populism and related issues. So I would say that in the UK, we actually, in the main, have a very good approach within society generally towards freedom of religion. There are some issues that we could deal with, such around, for example, the establishment issue and what that might mean, and could we, and does establishment necessarily imply that bishops of the Church of England have voting rights in the House of Lords? Should they remain in the House of Lords? Our monarch has to be a member of a particular Christian denomination, which again is rather unusual, but that's a much bigger question. So looking at the UK's position, I think you have to look at each of the individual nations within the UK, because to talk about the UK generally doesn't recognize the fact that there are different attitudes and a very different context. So I'm from Northern Ireland originally, and clearly the whole religious background, political background is very different, and the role of religion in society is quite different than the role of religion in England. The Scottish situation is quite different. There are different approaches in law to blasphemy within the United Kingdom. There are different approaches to, I think, the role of religions generally in public affairs and within the devolved administrations and in Westminster. So, yeah, I think it's not an easy analysis. I think once you start digging deep into the questions, you do get into the historical development of religion within the different parts of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, and when we're doing these interviews with Freedom Declared, we're trying to get as broad a background and make sure that all 4 nations within the United Kingdom are represented, not only because of the devolved settlements, but because of the cultural, historical backgrounds are different in each country, and the religious, social background has resulted in different contexts. You can't just paint the UK with one brush when trying to discover freedom of religion or belief. So yeah, it's very important, as you say, to make that distinction. And with devolution, legal differences are starting to come as well. So how does that impact the societal? So yeah, it's very complicated and gets more complex as you dig deeper. But that's why we're here, to try and do that digging, to see if any patterns can emerge. One thing that I did find interesting in your first answer was the emphasis on interfaith and dialogue. How important do you think it is the critical aspect of ensuring that freedom of religion or belief is truly understood and therefore implemented?
I think as the UK has become a much more multi-religious, multicultural society, and there is no longer the same shared consensus based on one particular religion, the Christian origins. You know, at one time in the UK, interfaith meant Jewish-Christian relations. So you had the Council for Christians and Jews formed in the 1940s. There were, at that time, clearly other religious groups in Britain. The Zoroastrians have been here since the 19th century, and a small Muslim community. But generally, it's only as we've become a much more diverse society, I think that is raising then the challenges that we need to know one another. And when you encounter the anti-Semitism and the Islamophobia, that is highlighted in some of the reports on religious freedom in the UK by outsiders, which are interesting to read, actually, to see ourselves as others see us is a phrase you'll be aware of. You know, they highlight these issues. So working to build good interfaith relations within the UK. And I think we've got a very good platform. As you mentioned, I was a trustee of the Interfaith Network for the UK. You know, we are ahead of many European countries, certainly in terms of our institutional structures around supporting interfaith dialogue and interfaith engagement with government across the four nations in different ways. But you know, we within IARF, when we've had global congresses or we have European gatherings, it's not simply been about this is the law, you know, this is how we can improve religious freedom. We try and build into those meetings and conferences an experience of interfaith relationships. So we have what are called circle groups, where within the conference, groups of 6, maybe more, people will get together from different faith traditions and explore a theme, a planned theme over the course of the meeting. And then you connect and you get to know real people from other traditions and get to experience how they see the world, which often is quite different than we see the world. You see their traditions, but also you experience how do we cross the boundaries, because often at the margins it is where we have richness for dialogue, and that's what we've tried to do when we get together as an interfaith group.
Yeah, and I think that's very important, that dialogue, and yeah, not only just speaking to each other, but seeking to understand each other and understand different perspectives rather than your own. One of the interviews that we've done, the person I was interviewing said that whilst interfaith work is very important, some people have a hesitancy to do interfaith work because they are worried or scared that they might offend people by saying the wrong thing or by saying a phrase differently. So what would your advice be with your experience in this field to people to overcome those worries, to ensure that interfaith work not only continues but grows?
Yeah, in my experience, building the personal relationships over time will build a platform to be able to explore more sensitive issues. I think most people are realistic and actually sensitive about how they will respond to what other people say if it's done in a way that they seek to learn rather than instruct. The whole issue of proselytization obviously comes up sometimes. It's not something that's been an issue in the UK that I've experienced, but clearly we have relationships in India where it is a big issue between the different faith groups, between various faith groups, and so yeah, you have to build a platform. There's also concerns I know that some people have about a blurring or a blending of religions. But if you begin to examine the historical development of various religious traditions, many of them have evolved out of from within other traditions and then grown in their own right. And that's where the view of freedom in religion, that religion needs to evolve and change in regarding the different cultures, how society has changed, the issues that people are addressing. Because most people come to religion or also another belief system to help them negotiate the world that they live in my view. Others may disagree. So religion needs to be continually evolving and learning from society and vice versa.
Yeah, and you mentioned there about the difference within the United Kingdom and your example of India. Whilst we do talk about freedom of religion or belief, there is a consensus or a consensus within the United Kingdom that we are doing relatively good, whereas other parts of the world are not, and that our focus should be on things happening elsewhere in the world. That's where we should be putting our efforts to champion freedom of religion or belief. But I would be interested to know your thoughts. Do you think that if the UK were to be seen to be taking the implementation of freedom of religion or belief domestically seriously, would that help the UK's efforts in championing freedom of religion or belief across the world?
Yeah, IARF is one of the organizations that has joined the UK Forum, which brings together, I think, increasingly all the key agencies. But it has a focus externally. It doesn't have a focus on the UK. So fundamentally, that project, in a sense, is about the UK doing more around freedom of religion externally, and the Foreign Office clearly have got programs and activities. But I think the point you make, underpinning your question, is that if we don't have our house in order, actually, how credible will we be? We obviously have to also understand that the UK, in many parts of the world, brings a huge baggage around its own history, its own engagement with particular societies, even within the Commonwealth. And that we, I think, have to be, to use a word that isn't around a lot, we have to be humble in how we approach other parts of the world. And it's not for us to necessarily stand on our high horse and point out the flaws in other. When you point the finger at someone, there's usually three. Point it back at yourself. So I think we need to have this debate around something and listen to what other people are saying about us. So, for example, the US State Department has its annual freedom of religion report that includes the United Kingdom. How are we taking that into account in our deliberations about? And they're not the only agency. There are several other surveys which will assess how well Britain is doing. The United Nations Human Rights Council will have a periodic review of the UK, and that would be an opportunity for those with concerns about religious freedom issues, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, for example, to be raised, and for our government to then have to justify its position. So there are forums out there that we do have to, as a society, defend what has happened and what is happening, and the direction of travel. around religious freedom. But no, I think if we get on our high horse, it may not have a pleasant outcome.
Yeah, the use of your word humble and humility, I think, are the key is the key characteristic, and that's why Freedom Declared was set up, because not only were there concerns about freedom of religion or belief in the UK, but we want to be the most effective as we can be championing freedom of religion or belief around the world. And yeah, that means taking a step back and saying, where can we improve, and listening to people around the world who do comment on the UK as well, just as you said. One question that I ask everyone that we interview, and it tends to be the final question, is what changes do you think the UK has to make to implement freedom of religion or belief better than we currently do?
Personally, and this is a personal view, I think we do have to look at the whole issue of establishment. And I doubt if that will happen, although there will be, constitutional changes around the House of Lords where, could facilitate that in the future, because I think the current makeup of the House of Lords is ultimately unsustainable. And with the role of the bishops within that, because that comes up in all of the reports on the UK. It's always mentioned as a potential issue. We do need, I think, as a society, to be continually promoting the interfaith work, and agencies do experience difficulties around funding. I think there could be a lot more work around that, and there is certainly there is support from the government for the interfaith network, but clearly budgets are going to be constrained generally around public affairs. So actually some, and that needn't necessarily be government funding. There are many big donors out there who, if they could be encouraged and directed around this agenda, and that would underpin some of the work on some of the legislative change that we might say, or and society, and promoting and addressing hate crimes of all sorts, and that again is clearly a sensitive issue, because there's quite distinctive views around where the issue is around that. So there'd be a couple of suggestions that I could leave you with.
Yeah, it's fascinating, because during all these interviews, the suggestions are so wide and varied, and that does show that we do have a long way to go in the UK to fully implement freedom of religion or belief. Shorter way than many countries, but still a long way to go. But thank you so much for your time, Derek. I don't know, it looks like you're about to say something.
I was just going to say, the one point I would also make is that the recognition that we live in an increasingly globalized world, and that the UK will be and is increasingly being affected by what goes on in other countries in relation to religious freedom. So the diasporas in Britain from around the world are influencing not only their country of origins, but also how relationships may be developing within the UK. And that means that we need to, agencies like your own, need to be have that on the radar. So, for example, the case in Glasgow of the murder of an Ahmadiyya Muslim, for which was a religiously motivated crime, is clearly a significant event And who knows how the future will if the world it looks like becoming more increasingly unstable, that will seep back into relationships within the UK in interesting ways. So we need to be have that on our radar.
Yes, no, that's a very important point. And yes, when we're reflecting on the UK, we can't just ignore what's happening elsewhere. As you said, that we're becoming so interconnected that events elsewhere impact events here. And yeah, that's very important. But yes, thank you so much for your time today. And yeah, your comments have been very interesting and a lot to reflect on. And yes, for everyone who has been watching, I hope that you enjoyed it. Please do share your comments on the video. And yes, if you want to keep up to date with the State of the Nation interviews, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook. But yes, thank you, Derek, once again for your time, and hopefully we can continue this engagement in the future.
Indeed, thank you, James. I've enjoyed it. Bye.